Most philosophers in their own lifetime are either celebrated, like Hegel, or suffer obscurity, like Nietzsche. Notoriety is a little more rare. Monsieur Renaud Camus prefers to think of himself as a writer, a man of letters, but his reputation has come to precede such preferences. He is widely regarded as that rarest of things, a notorious philosopher, perhaps the most notorious in the Western world since Martin Heidegger. But whereas Heidegger became notorious for his personal association with the Nazi Party, Camus has become notorious for his intellectual output. Today I have the distinct honor of being welcomed by Monsieur Camus into his castle home in Plieux, southwestern France, to discuss these infamous ideas. A man of letters should have especially sensitive antennae. This means a gift for naming civilizational phenomena and examining their implications for the future. Camus has achieved this by giving a provocative name to what he regards as the disaster of our time, the organizing principle of late modernity, Replacism, or Replacism. The tendency to replace everything, as he puts it, with its normalized, standardized, interchangeable double, the original by its copy, the authentic by its imitation, the true by the false, mothers by surrogate mothers, culture by leisure activities and entertainment, knowledge by diplomas, the countryside and the city by the universal suburb, the native by the non-native, Europe by Africa, men by women, men and women by robots, peoples by other peoples, humanity by a savage, undifferentiated, standardized, infinitely interchangeable post-humanity. Is this sheer rhetoric or an accurate diagnosis of the West's sickness? If accurate, is resistance futile or morally required of us? And when it comes to replacement migration in particular, what form should this resistance take? Monsieur Camus, welcome to the Forge.
Thank you very much.
In England, we are in a very sorry state at the moment. We have a Muslim Pakistani mayor of London who boasts openly about the reverse colonisation of the English. There are poems on the London Underground in which he is gloating about this, which he has authorised. Until very recently, we also had a Pakistani First Minister of Scotland who made a point of complaining about how Scotland is much too white. Meanwhile, you have written about Britain and the rest of Europe in the following terms. You write, "The great replacement of the English people on its territory, the German people on its, of the Italians in Italy, the foreordained and already well-advanced suffocation of these great cultures and majestic civilizations that gave Europe its incomparable worth, distress me no less than the replacement of the French people in France." What do you think it says about the British state that our borders are open to foreigners who openly despise us? Meanwhile, you are banned from the country for liking us.
Well, I think obviously the power, whatever it is, be it left or right, it doesn't make much difference, wants the change of people because something above it, somebody or something, but I would rather think something, want different people in Europe is a mechanism which do not want the indigenes of Europe to still be the masters of their own territories, of their own country, and something wants them change. And I think it is, of course, a crime of the 21st century. The crimes against humanity of the 21st century is that change of people, which is certainly the worst thing one can do to a people, changing, decide that it won't do anymore and we want a different people. And it is what all governments in Western Europe are doing, whether they admit it or not. And sometimes it's even worse when they say that they are doing otherwise, because what they still call immigration, which I think is a totally obsolete word. Immigration was something else entirely, as a phenomenon of the late 19th century and of 20th century, but the demographic submersion which is taking place now has nothing to do with immigration. But what they say they are going to control immigration or moderate immigration or choose immigration and make new law for that. I don't know, the same thing in England, but in France, when they start saying that, you can be sure that in the law there would be a long part saying, making it more difficult for foreigners to come to France, but there will be another part which will make it much easier, and the result of the new law supposed to control or moderate immigration will be that it will be even worse, and it's getting worse and worse. Now, for instance, there is a new law supposed to moderate immigration, but which gives tremendous attention to what they call the profession under stress, that is lacking people to work for them.
Yes.
And in that case, in those professions, it would be made much easier for foreigners to come to France. And that is, of course, the very core of the law. The rest is just decoration, like chantilly on a cake, to make it look better. But there's a very core of the law, and that there will be even more immigration because people in restaurants, in hotels, in tourism, and many other professions want more people coming. So there will be more people coming, and no less.
The Great Replacement is I've already brought it up. It's a term that, as I understand it, came to you in the 1990s when you were traveling through a French village, and you were struck by not just the presence of individual North Africans, but by the sort of wholesale replacement that appeared to have happened in this term. The Great Replacement came to you. Of course, around the West, there is a great deal of confusion around this phrase, and I suspect as well, and I'm sure you probably agree, some of that confusion is deliberate. People are pretending to be confused more than they really are confused. Could you very briefly explain the phenomena that you mean to describe with the term the Great Replacement? What are you trying to describe?
Well, it can be described in very few words. The change of people, which of course implies a change of civilization, because it's a total illusion to pretend that you can change the people and keep the same civilization. If people who are not English will not have England anymore, which is proven every day. Yes. England looks less and less like England, or in many parts of it, at least. Great Replacement is just that. But unfortunately, Great Replacement is not at all a theory. It's nothing of a theory. It's just a name for a period and for the main phenomenon of that period. It's what is technically called a chrononym, like the Victorian era or the Great Depression or the Great War or the Great Pest. It's Black Pest.
Black Plague, yes.
Yes. It's a name for a period. And it's not at all a theory. I have a theory which is called global replacism, and as enormous as Great Replacement might be, and it is an enormous phenomenon, it's only a small part of what I call global replacism, which is constructed against the idea that the replacement of something by something else, and that people by other people, is the very core or essence of modernity or of industrial, post-industrial societies.
Yes, well, we will get into the difference between the Great Replacement and your broader understanding of Replacisme in due course. But for the moment, staying on the Great Replacement, which it is correct to say in your thought is more of an aspect of an overall phenomena that you're describing than it is the governing principle of your thought. Does the Great Replacement itself have a single guiding intelligence? There is this idea that some people have this concern that you're saying that there is some organized conspiracy, an organized cabal, or is it more decentralized than that?
Well, journalists, of course, I do not put you in their ranks, but journalists are obsessed by the term conspiracy. It must have been taught to them in their school. And they say, when you are people you don't like and who don't think right, you have to tell them that they are promoting a theory, a conspiracy theory. They absolutely adore that expression. And of course, Great Replacement, as I said, is not at all a theory. And I never mentioned the slightest conspiracy, which would be an absurd word for the enormity of what is going on, which I try to explain. But it's not a conspiracy. I don't think that people one day went into a room and decided that they were going to change the population of Europe. It's a much more complex financial, industrial phenomenon, and it's certainly not a conspiracy. And I never denounced any conspirators. That's not at all was important in my analysis of the phenomenon.
Not only does Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, use the term reverse colonisation or colonisation to describe mass immigration, which I think is obviously, in his case, a very revealing use of words. You also have been known in your writing to describe mass immigration, or whatever you want, replacement migration, as a form of colonisation.
Oh yes,
that
very much
taking place. I actually wonder whether this is somewhat an ambiguous term, because there are really two forms of colonisation, I would argue. I would argue that there is demographic colonisation, which is, of course, what we in the West, in Europe, in North America, and Australasia are living through, demographic colonisation. But then there is also what we might call administrative colonisation, not dissimilar to what, say, the English did, or the British in India. And the British in India were actually quite humane demographically. They realized that too many white civil servants would cause anxiety among local Indian populations. And so there were strict limits on how many white British people were allowed to settle in India to administer the Raj, so as not to unsettle the Indian population. So if the Great Replacement is a form of colonization, we could argue that it is much more final and much more devastating than most European forms of colonialism. Would you agree with that?
Oh yes, definitely.
Yes.
Colonization is very much at the center of my reflection. Now I'm writing a book called Decolonization, and that I think I will have said all I have to say. That would be, I think, my last books on politics, which is just in me an accidental venture. But I think, of course, Europe is 10 times or 100 times more colonized than it ever colonized itself. Also, I have to admit that, for instance, British or Spanish or Portuguese colonization are very different from French, Belgian, Dutch, continental colonization. But I think the essence of colonization historically is the transfer of population. When you start speaking of colonization in Western culture, it is the fact that some cities in continental Greece and also in Phoenicia, in present-day Lebanon, decided that there were too many people in the city, or they were not what the other wanted, and they left, and they went mostly to Sicily and the south of Italy, what was called Great Greece, and also in North Africa. And that was the start of what is called colonization, is a transfer of population. That is the very core of what colonization is. And of course, English colonization for a long time was very much that in the present United States, in Canada,
Yes.
in Australia, in New Zealand. It was a demographic colonization, whereas French was very different, with two exceptions. In 17th and 18th century, in North America, in Canada, in Louisiana, there were a transfer of population, and there's still French population of French ascent in Quebec. And the other case was in Algeria in 19th century, where there were rather important French, not only French, also Spanish and Italian, but mostly French. Colonizers.
Yes.
And, but everywhere else in the French colonial empire was much an empire than a colonization. For instance, in Africa, there are very few French people, which makes decolonization much easier,
Yes,
of course. It was just an imperial, military, economical conquest, which doesn't make it more palatable, but it is at least make it much easier to get rid of.
Well, I suppose in one sense that does make it somewhat more palatable, because it means that the colonization experience is in principle always reversible. Because
yes, exactly.
Whereas in the case of demographic colonization, there comes a critical mass at which point it becomes morally irreversible and therefore probably is more sinister.
And the case of India, which you yourself mentioned, is more like that type of colonization, like an empire. Well, it was an empire of India.
Yes.
With Victoria as Empress of India.
Yes.
So she was Indian. Then you can't be Empress of a country without being Indian. Yes. She was Indian, like Mr. Sadiq Khan, which you mentioned, is British, exactly in the same way.
But we didn't pretend so much. This is another thing. This is another feature of European colonization. There wasn't a pretense.
Well, it was very much a colony, but in a different sense of the word, not as close to the essence of what colonization is.
Yes.
So we are much more colonized today, be it in France or in England or in Germany, or not to mention unfortunate Belgium, which is, or the Irish.
Yes.
Even the term of reverse colonization is wrong, because country which never had any colonies, like Norway or Sweden or Denmark, are very small colonies, but practically no colony at all. Or Austria never had any colonies, and the change of population is absolutely equal to that of country which had colonies. So the present colonization of Europe has not nothing to do, but rather little to do with the fact that there were colonial powers themselves. It's not a reverse colonization, not a vengeance, vindication. Yes. But it is much more colonization that that's what was practiced by those very countries. But it also gives a hope, a reason to hope, because colonization implies decolonization, and it solves, in my way of thinking, the enormous matter of here is a word I cannot pronounce in English, of the law.
Of the law.
Of the law.
Yes.
I can't make a difference between law and the law.
Oh, I see.
The law.
Like loi.
Yes, la loi.
Of the law. Loi.
You have only, I think, one word for what in French is two different things, le droit et la loi, which are both the law. The law, is that right?
That's right. I understand you, and I expect our...
Very difficult word for a Frenchman to pronounce, the law.
I expect our audience understands you as well.
I respect the law, but I can't pronounce it.
Yes. Yeah, that's as good as we can hope for under the circumstances. There was actually a very amusing remark made by Lord Hardinger, who was the Viceroy of India in around 1915, 1916, I think. And he made this point that, I shall say the remark first.
1960?
1916.
Oh, 1916.
16, yes.
Sorry.
He said about the British colonization of India, and this emphasizes the way in which it was administrative, not demographic. He said, if every single Indian in the Raj were to pick up just a handful of sand and cast it by united effort on all of the English people, we would be buried alive, because the English population was so small. And the other thing that I think, I'm not wholly defending every aspect of European colonization, but
neither am I.
I know you're not.
Absolutely not.
But I do think that even though it was abusive and exploitative in places, it was more of a relationship between peoples. It wasn't completely pervaded by this spirit of Replacism that you talk about. It understood distinctions between peoples, and to some extent, it tended to respect them much more than is the case with reverse colonization of the kind that we're living through today. I don't know whether you agree with that.
Oh, I agree with that entirely. And there has been all sorts of colonization. Some were terrible, and some were rather moderate and civilized, and they did bring a lot of good.
Yes.
The good with the proviso that sometimes the good is the worst thing it brought. For instance, it's certain that European colonization in Africa is what made the Africans so enormously numerous. I'm not a great... I'm not very much in favor of demographic explosion as a whole. I think it's one of the worst menace against humanity as a whole, which we were much better off when we were 2 billion or 3 billion of people than 8 or 9 now. So I'm not sure that developing demography was a good thing, but it certainly helped medically the population which were colonized.
Yes, and particularly in the case of Africa, which even to this day, it still imports something like 80% of its food, of its grain, I think. That could be slightly wrong, but nevertheless, it's not a self-sustaining enterprise, and so those sorts of what was he called? Malthusian concerns make more sense in the African context, perhaps, than in others. Another thing that you are, other phrases that you have used, other language that you have used in your description of this phenomena are sort of genocide by substitution. That's quite a provocative framing. And of course, you've also used the term slavery and conquest to describe the eventual outcome of the Great Replacement.
Slavery,
that how you
I might have, but not much.
At one point in one of your essays that I was reading, admittedly translated into English because my French is not good enough to read you in French, you said that when European countries have lose any sense of their national identity, while the rest of the world continues to nurture a very, very strong sense of their national identity, that unbalanced dynamic can only lead in the future to slavery and conquest of the former at the expense of the latter.
I think there might be a slight problem of translation.
Okay.
I think, I might be wrong, but I think the word I use is asservissement, which can be translated in slavery, but it's not exactly. Asservissement is becoming dependent.
Subordinate.
It's not exactly slavery.
I see.
Subordination.
Yes.
Not being master
Of your destiny.
of one's own destiny. But I don't think I use very much the term slavery in French.
Yes. What is it in French?
Esclavage.
Esclavage. Esclavage. And
Which is not the same thing as asservissement.
Okay.
Asservissement is like in the Middle Age you are serf.
Yes.
What would that be in English? Serf.
Peasant or serf.
Serf.
We say serf, yes.
It's not exactly the same thing as slave.
No, indeed not.
For one thing.
So it's
But you mentioned the expression
genocide by
genocide by substitution, which I do use, but I'm not the father. I did not invent the term.
Okay.
The term was invented by a French poet who was black and a communist, who was Mayor Fort-de-France in the French Antilles, in La Martinique. Fort-de-France is the main city is there, and he was mayor of the city for 50 years. And he was also deputy at the French Parliament, and he used it in a speech at the Assemblée Nationale in Paris.
Okay.
And he was speaking, in his opinion, there were far too many French civil servants in Martinique.
Oh, right.
And they were taking all the social activities, and he could not go on like that. He wanted less people from French, what we did call La Métropole, which is the main country, in La Martinique, and he calls that a genocide by substitution. Too many French people in the island.
Right.
But I think the expression applies much, much, much more and is much more apt to the situation in Europe today than it was in Martinique, in the saying of Aimé Césaire, the poet. The term of genocide is, of course, very strong, but I insist that the one who coined the term, Raphael Lemkin, the Polish jurist, he was a man of law to begin with, coined the term in 1944, 1945. And of course, he had in mind the genocide of the Jews, but he precised that a genocide is not limited to industrial massacre, and it doesn't necessarily imply massacre either. If you make the soul, the spirit, and mostly the memory of a people disappeared, it is also a genocide. And for instance, in the writing of Milan Kundera, the Czech writer about Czechoslovakia, in his early writing, I don't think he used the term genocide, but what he described is the memory of a people being stolen from it, his language, his culture, everything, which is very much what is happening in French. French culture is practically disappearing, and young people have no idea of French history or French literature, of anything. It is also genocide. Genocide is not only industrial massacre, and you don't have, but genocide by substitution is, I think, genocide is a crime which has most progress since the genocide of the Jews. It is much more modern and intelligent, and has a much better image. Of course, the image is very important. They managed to make genocide the real thing, it has a very good image. The change of people in France has an excellent image.
It's marketed as a progress.
Yes.
Yes.
I think communication and publicity was very important in the evolution of that crime. But it is no less a crime. But it is certainly less atrocious, but it is no less effective, and it is even much wider in span, and it concerns even many more people than the genocide of the Jews, of which, of course, I do not contest for a second.
Of course.
The atrocity and even the uniqueness. But what is going on is of geopolitical consequence, even larger than that, because it is all European people. We are in the way of disappearing, and that is probably the worst crime ever committed.
Do you think that part of the reason why many people, including me, but maybe instinctively have an aversion to the use of the word genocide is because the way that genocide operates as a concept in our culture, we focus so much on the process of genocide and less on the logical endpoint of genocide. I mean, we think of the killing fields, we think of the Holodomor, we think of Auschwitz, Birkenau, these sorts of places. We think of the violence that is usually deployed as part of the process of genocide, but we think less about what the outcome is, which is really built into the concept, the idea that a people no longer exists anymore. And it doesn't really matter what the process, what the delivery system for that is. What matters is the endpoint itself, and that is also a part of the concept of genocide.
Yes. I'm a great admirer of Aldous Huxley.
Yes.
People always mention Orwell, but I think Aldous Huxley is even more to the point that Orwell, and he has very well seen that the totalitarian, that's another difficult one for me, totalitarianism to come would be ludic, pleasant, almost a joke.
Inoffensive.
And inoffensive. And people will be amused by it and will want it. Will want it. That is a modern form of totalitarianism. And fascinating figures like Edward Bernays, was extraordinarily cynical because he wrote a book called Propaganda, and of course in his writings and in his life, in his activities, there is no frontier between publicity, commercial publicity, and political propaganda. And in his work, he was working even for for cigarettes companies, or for people who wanted to be a governor of an United States state. And he also made so that communication was becoming so important that the worst thing would become pleasant. And of course, the role of publicity in the present genocide by substitution is absolutely enormous.
When you say publicity, you mean advertising?
Advertising, yes. There is
it's
not exactly the same thing, but advertising. I don't know what is the situation exactly in England, but in France, all advertising for whatever thing, be it fridge or is always imply that there is not a white couple anymore. That can't be in publicity. You have to have a white woman and a black man. And that's absolutely all advertising. Or even if by chance the man and the woman would both be white, which very seldom happens. They would have black children. God knows why.
Which is even more of an oddity.
You can't have in publicity a family who would not be mixed. So publicity is, of course, very important in the Great Replacement. And publicity is not only commercial, it is, of course, very much ideological and political. I think publicity is the whole literature of modern world. It's poetry, it's novel, it's epics. Everything is publicity has taken charge of that.
So when we think about when we read your use of the term genocide by substitution, or your reproduction of that term by that black gentleman from Martinique, we should think about it more in terms the delivery system for that. We should view more in terms of Huxley's Brave New World and less in terms of the Orwell's 1984 and the room 101 and that sort of thing.
Oh yes, yes. I think Huxley is more to the point than Orwell, but I greatly admire Orwell.
Of course.
But I think Huxley has seen that the disaster to come. What was important was that it would be wanted, that people would want it.
Would welcome it.
They would want to become stupid. There was a great desire for imbecility, which imply asservissement, which is not exactly slavery,
but a kind of,
becoming dependent, including dependent to oneself, to one's own desire, as provided by publicity.
Yes, a kind of irreversible loss of agency and personhood. Another potential difficulty with the use of the term genocide, and I promise we will get off this in a moment, but it is obviously a very value-laden, morally charged concept, the concept of genocide. It contains very strong moral implications. It's widely regarded correctly as an immoral act, and immoral acts, of course, require agents. It requires someone to have mens rea, to have a guilty mind. Given that you believe genocide by substitution is taking place, there do need to be some agents involved in it.
Of course.
How are we to attribute responsibility? We were talking earlier about, obviously, people did not get in a room and plan the Great Replacement, but it's more dispersed and more complex than that. But given that genocide is a moral concept, it requires an agent, it requires mens rea, how do we attribute responsibility?
Well, for one thing, I must say that I have insisted that the term genocide doesn't imply industrial killing or massacre, and not even killing not industrial. But I am a bit too generous on that point, because there are an enormous number of murder. I mean, people are killed every day, and life is becoming unbearable. Even what I call the central sewer media is obliged to admit that the situation is becoming impossible. You can look at very official media and what kind of society that with, for instance, children are refusing to obey the police, or children of 15 or 13 in driving cars and not obeying the police. Doctors can't go to certain zone. Firemen are attacked. When there are fire, you call for the firemen. The firemen are attacked in many zones in France. And people in prison are directing the drug traffic, and there is revolts in the prisons all the time. The situation is obviously unbearable. And who is responsible of that? You mentioned agents. Yes, I think there are agents. Maybe it's time to speak about global replacism, but I think at the center of things, there is a mechanical way to make people exchangeable.
To make people?
Exchangeable, who can be exchanged.
Oh, exchangeable, yes.
Which is the very essence of capitalism or liberalism. At the center of that, there is a will that everything can be exchanged. And for a long time, it was only product, industrial product. but man has been made into a product. And there is what I call Davocracy, the government of the world by Davos, which be them the GAFAMs or the international companies or big tech and big state, which is a very tiny number of people, and the concentration is such that maybe it's not even people. The management of the world has become what Heidegger called the Gestalt, the dispositif. A dispositif. I like very much the word dispositif because it's not necessarily people. It's just a way of considering the world as only a field of exploitation. And I think that conception of the world is what is choosing people for any function. You can't be anything in a democratic society if you do not show that you won't oppose, at least, to that conception of the world. You can't be elected. You can't be a judge. You can't be a journalist. You can't be a writer. You can't be anything if you don't subscribe to the official ideology of that being called anti-racism, which anti-racism is, of course, what is wanted by Davocracy and by the managerial conception of the world, because it doesn't want any distinction between people, be there of race, now of sex, very important. Sex has to disappear also, obviously, and of culture, of heritage, of any characteristic of man, he has to renounce so he can become absolutely exchangeable, like a product that he is. And that system is so strong and powerful that you can't be anything if you don't subscribe to it. There's no difference between the left and the right. Of course, the left is dearer to the dispositive because its traditional ideals are exactly what it wants, namely equality and anti-racism. Equality and anti-racism are perfect for global replacism because they make people all the same, which is the ideal, so they can be exchangeable. But the right can survive only if it applies those principles. So, as I said before, when they make law which are supposed to be right, it only serves the same purpose. So there's absolutely no difference in my mind between right and left, because right is sort of pretext.
Yes, I would say that the right, increasingly today, it still adopts a conservative disposition to the world in some sense, but what it is conserving is very often, are the achievements of yesterday's left-wingers. So T.K. Chesterton once joked.
Exactly. They can't survive only by mimicking the left, but doing their policy, which would be easier to make accepted if it is done by the right, by the victims.
T.K. Chesterton once said that the great problem with the left is that they make mistakes, and the great problem with the right is that it doesn't get around to correcting those mistakes because of its conservative frame of mind. So there probably is some truth in that. The reason I ask about the responsibility is that the last time that there was a great genocide in Europe, of course I'm talking about the Holocaust, not only was it roundly condemned, but there were trials. I mean, there were the Nuremberg trials, and like those who did not kill themselves, like Hermann Göring did, and those who did not manage to escape to South America, the high-ranking Nazis at least, were hanged. Do you think that there needs to be a similar sort of tribunal of sorts, or a similar sort of trial? I mean, what does justice look like under these circumstances? Does it look justice for genocide, as it were? If it is a genocide that is taking place, does it take that form, or are you more of the view that we need to embody the spirit of Lincoln, charity for all, malice toward none? What are your views on what justice would look like in this context?
Well, personally, I have absolutely no feeling of vindication. I have many friends who says, when it would be power, there would be a new Nuremberg and all that.
Yes.
Maybe so, but I think the most important thing is to put those people out of the possibility of action, to deprive them of their political influence. But I'm not, I must say, not very interested in whatever will happen of them. I think, what is mépris in English?
Mépris.
Despising them?
Okay. Contempt, maybe?
Contempt.
Yes.
Contempt. Mépris must be contempt. Quite enough.
Yes.
No, I have no spirit of vindication.
Of vengeance. Vengeance, yes.
Vengeance.
Yes.
If people insist on them, they can be judged. But
yes.
What does it matter? What matters is they would be put out of power. But the question of the law is, of course, very important, and is why the concept of decolonization is all important, because, of course, there can't be decolonization with the law which makes colonization. We are living under a colonial law with colonial judges, so we won't be able to go on with the colonial law.
Yes.
As I wrote lately, in Western culture, there is that permanent myth, at least since Sophocles, of the l'enquêteur, the inquest, the man who
the interlocutor, or the inquisitor,
the inquisitor, the detective.
Oh, the detective.
As a detective, being the criminal, not knowing it.
Yes.
At least since Oedipus, not knowing it, but being the criminal.
I see. Yes,
but we are in an entirely new literary and conceptual situation where we find out that it is the law which is a criminal.
Right. Yes.
What is condemning Europe to the genocide by substitution, or genocide by great replacement to the great repulsion? It is the law. And the law has been wanted by Davocracy and by Heidegger dispositive. And the law has to be changed, and only the concept of decolonization can give reason. I am very much for the law. Of course, I do not recommend a state who would have no law, but we have to replace the law. We have to have a law which doesn't make it necessary to change the people, the culture, and the civilization. And not only the law would have to be changed, but also the judges, because even when the right makes disposition which seems to moderate more or less the immigration, as they call it, there always are the judges and the courts who say, oh no, you can't do that, you can't absolutely do that, that's contrary to the droit de l'homme, to the European court, and even to the international convention or the treaties. You absolutely can't do that. Sometimes, very rarely, people are expelled from France by a legal decision, but it never works. Because the law says, no, you absolutely can't do that. They are right when they say that they have a right to be here, and that their children are already, you can't expel them, that's impossible. Absolutely no one is expelled. Maybe five or six people a year are expelled. And it is the law prevent any resistance to the change of people and civilization. So the criminal is the law.
Goodness me, yes. Well, you mentioned there the concept of anti-racism in an essay that you've written that is reproduced in Vauban Books' English translation of some of your political writings. It's called The Enemy of Disaster. You run with the idea that anti-racism is the communism of the 21st century. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, very much so. It is like a genocide by substitution. The phrase is not by me, but by my friend Alain Finkielkraut, called anti-racism, the communism of 21st century.
Yes.
And it is, of course, very much same thing as what communist was in France, for instance, and in Italy, maybe a bit less in England, but all intellectuals today are anti-racist, like they were all communists in the 50s and 60s. And my idea is that anti-racism has totally changed meaning. Mm-hmm. Anti-racism, when it was born after the concentration camps, after the death camps, had the highest possible legitimacy, and everybody had all reason to be anti-racist. And anti-racism was something protective of the races which were the most directly menaced, first of them being, of course, at the time the Jews, but also black people or the gypsies or all races which were under menace. But in about 30 years, for one thing, that total legitimacy gave anti-racism total power. Anti-racism was the official ideology of the world, and total power is always a bit dangerous.
Of course.
If you said you were anti-racist, you had immediate power, and you couldn't have any power if you were not saying that you were anti-racist. So everybody was anti-racist, like most people were communists in intellectual circles in the 50s, and the word has totally changed meaning. The moment where it changed meaning was what I call the dogma of the inexistence of races, which happened about or less in the middle of the 1770s in the 20th century, when it established that there were no races, which implies genocide, of course, because if there are no races, there must not be racist. Of course, it was totally absurd, but there were no races, but they were all equal. So it's a logical impossibility. And I think science, which were at that time the new God, science had become the supreme instance of truth after the Nietzschean death of God. It replaced faith. If science was saying something, it had to be believed. And I think, in my opinion, science has never been so servile, so dependent to political and ideological and economical power, but in proclaiming that there are no races. For one thing, I'm not sure, I have no idea of biology or things like that, and races has never been of that order in my mind. But even in that respect, I think it is probably not true. But the biological, scientific part of what a race is about 2% or 3% that races are, which is one of the world's the best inscribed in Western and all civilization, I think. And it has infinities of meanings. It can be family, it can be lineage, it can be, and anything can be a race. It's a very plastic concept. But the dogma couldn't be proclaimed. Strangely enough, only if you took the word in the silly, very narrow meaning of the worst race, of the worst races, a biological meaning, which is, I think, of very little importance and of sort of criminal past. But only if you take the word in that absurd meaning, you could say that races do not exist. And at that time, I think anti-racism has become genocidal because races cannot exist, and to prove the dogma, you have to make them disappear, and you do not disappear them necessarily by killing all the members of those races, but of destructing their culture, their civilization, mostly by demographical submersion. And it is the proclamation of the dogma which made the great replacement possible. Not only did it make it possible, but it made it impossible to have the slightest resistance to it. Because if you resisted to what was happening, you were immediately a racist. And of course, after the Second World War, no one would want to be a racist. The nice people wanted to be. And you could not object. If there are no races, what can you object if your city is becoming populated by an entirely different population? Are they not same as you are?
Yes.
Are they not? There are no races, so what's the difference?
So, in other words, the concept of anti-racism has gone from meaning the morally irreproachable view that no man should be reduced to his racial origins, and still less should any man have violence done to him on the basis of his origin, of his group origins. It's gone from meaning that, which is morally irreproachable and felt particularly morally irreproachable in the aftermath of the Second World War, given those horrors, to meaning there are no differences between peoples. The human populations, we're just sort of organic matter, like what Heidegger would call standing reserve. We're just like to be the focus of Gestell, or like in framing, just to be moved around as may fit certain human purposes. And so the defense of any kind of group particularities or cultural particularities then comes to seem racist. And so the definition has been sort of flexible over time, and that makes it quite similar to communism, because communism was similarly very promiscuous in its use of moral concepts. I suppose one thing that that's a nice word to put it. I suppose one thing that does make it slightly different from communism is that communism, at any rate, in theory, claims to be a universalist ideology. When you examine the concept of anti-racism, it becomes clear very quickly, as soon as you observe how it functions in our discourse, that the obligations to be anti-racist only, and I mean here the obligation to be anti-racist in the silly definition, not the morally irreproachable definition, but the changed definition, the obligation to be anti-racist only really falls on white people. And so it is actually itself quite racist in that sense. And so we can maybe view it less as a universalist ideology like communism, and more as a form of anti-white predation. Would you agree with that?
Yes, certainly. The white population was the one, that, obviously, which was supposed necessary to get rid of for the Gestalt.
The Gestalt, yes. Yes.
Yes, because it was costing more, for one thing,
yes.
And it was reproducing less, exactly what they did not want. What they want was people costing less and reproducing more, which they got.
And let's see if they're happy with this. We've talked about the Second World War. Another excellent essay you've written is on the second career of Adolf Hitler, which connects which does connect to the contemporary appeal of anti-racism, you write that because of the way in which Hitler and the Second World War, still to this day, it looms very large over our cultural imagination. You write, any sort of we, first person plural, any sort of we with any claim to historical consistency has to be angrily prohibited. So any strong sense of peoplehood has to be denied, particularly in a European context, because Hitler himself invoked the notion of a we. He talked about the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, and the outsiders, the Volksfremde, the people who are alien peoples. And so because there is a loose connection between non-violent patriotism today and Hitler's sense of virulent nationalism, any sort of strong sense of collective identity is completely off the table. And so Hitler still lives through us negatively, and in your view is inflicting similar, if not identical damage, not least against European and broader Western populations.
Yes, very much so. I think the second career of Hitler is maybe a bit less criminal than the first one, but that it is of even larger and ampler consequence, because he's there looming as what I call an absolute weapon of discourse, and it can be used by people who want something, and as soon as you say something would displease, you are a Nazi or a neo-Nazi. I can testify of that. And if there's something I'm not, and he's a Nazi or a neo-Nazi, or never had the slightest sympathy for that. Quite to the contrary, I think anti-Replacism is the only coherent anti-Nazism, and as it is also the only coherent ecology or ecologism.
You mention ecology there. I think some people might be somewhat surprised to learn, if they haven't read you as comprehensively as some others have, that you don't think that high fertility by Europeans is a way of avoiding the Great Replacement. And I wonder what you would say about a counterexample like Israel, which does continue to have a very high fertility rate. That means that Israeli elites have no pretext to sponsor and facilitate the transfer of peoples into Israel. And of course, Israel also continues to have a very strong collective religious and indeed ethnic identity. But surely Israel is a demonstration of the fact that the higher fertility you have, the less likely you are to be subjected to replacement migration. You would disagree?
Yes.
Why?
Well, for one thing, I don't think the Great Replacement is a mechanical phenomenon like that. There is less people there, so there must be more coming in, all that. I don't think it works like that at all, except, of course, as a pretext.
Okay.
And I don't think Israel keeps being strong because of its high fertility rate. I think numbers are very little importance. Comparatively, Israel is absolutely nothing. It is in the
absolute
ocean
sense.
of foreign, very hostile people, which are all much more numerous than they are. Israel is strong because Israel is an idea, Israel is a religion, Israel is a race, Israel is a will, and Israel is for me the model of all. That's a word very difficult to translate in English. I say appartenance, belonging.
Yes.
I am very much of the idea that if Israel doesn't belong to the Jews and Jerusalem do not belong to Israel, there is absolutely no reason for France to belong to the French or Paris to belong to France.
Morally, the case is the same.
This is a golden standard of belonging, because it is a people which is the most ancient, one of the people, China, for instance, in its country by its name, its country by its myth, by its religion, by its tradition, by everything. And it is also a great example of decolonization. Of course, one never mentioned in colonial history the colonization by the Arabs. The Arab Muslim is the only colonial empire was never decolonized, with two exceptions. In Spain, it took 7 or 8 centuries, and in Israel, was a country which people come back to the country of its name after 20th century of absence, which is a great model for all other decolonial indigens. It's not quite to the contrary. It's not by the number that they are strong, it is by their will and by their intelligence and by their belonging to the land which wears their name.
And so you think it's more a case that Israel's high fertility rate is not the cause of their national health and their national cohesion, is more of a symptom of it, more evidence of it?
It might be a symptom, yes, but I don't think high fertility rates is very desirable.
Okay.
I think Earth is grossly overcrowded. I don't think the problem at all is Europeans not making enough children. Even in Europe, indigents have never been so numerous. Even in England, there have never been so many people indigent English as there are now.
In absolute terms?
Yes.
Yes.
In absolute terms. And the problem is not at all that Europeans do not make enough children. It is that the other races, for one thing, make far too many children, which they can't feed, and especially that they make them in Europe, and that they are paid for making them, which is absolutely absurd. All the policies which have been defined to grow, to augment to the fertility rate, were at the origin to defend the country and its people. And it works exactly the wrong way, because all the money goes to the people who make more children, that is the foreign occupier, the colonial occupier, which makes that Europe is the first continent ever who is paying for his own colonization. And people in the rest of the world just cannot believe that there are countries where you can go and you are paid to have children, that is to colonize them and to change the population. I think there are two great contradictions in political ecology. The first one is that they pretend that they are for difference in everything, biodiversity, as they call it, except for races, for culture, but civilization, for man. Man is outed from biodiversity, which is absurd. And the second is that all ecological programs and policies are absolutely nothing, are totally vain, as long as the question of number of the global population of Earth is not treated. No growth can be eternal, and the growth of human population is absolutely terrible. It's work that's an atomic bomb. And not only for, I'm not a great admirer of Malthus, which is a very boring writer, I think, and philosophy, and see it only as a matter of economic means. Says that if you are too many, there will be enough food for everybody. But that's only part of the problem. It's also a spiritual matter. I believe very much in the old Indian myth that there is a constant quantity of soul for the human population of the earth. And so, of course, the more people there are, the less soil.
It's spread more thinly.
Yes, and I think that's very, very true. And I think it's very important for the soul, for poetry, for culture, for the dignity of man to have absence. I'm a great admirer of absence. And in Europe, and maybe not especially in England, because in England's population is very concentrated, so there are still some countryside.
Yes.
But in countries like Belgium, Holland, there are no more countryside. The end of a town or city means the beginning of the next one. And so there is no solitude. I think civilization has been invented to make solitude possible. And, but if there are people everywhere, there's no solitude. And it's also in the Western tradition, when people had problem of any kind, including political problem, they always, as a poet, was thinking they had nature, but nature is slowing, disappearing. Countryside and town are mixing together in a sort of universal suburb, and with massive change of people, the universal suburb is changing into a universal slum, what I call a bidon monde. And anyway, I think England was much happy when it had, all Western countries were much happier when they have, say, 50 million inhabitants.
Yes.
Country was nicer, the air was better, the river were in better shape, there was not plastification of everything. I think all ecological problems have, for main reason, the growing population.
You talk there about a plastification of everything.
Yes.
Many people who are less familiar with your work might be curious to learn that, in your view, the Great Replacement is something that follows on logically, or maybe not logically, but maybe culturally, from something that you call the little replacement, le petit remplacement. Yes. And this is the idea in miniature, and you can elaborate, that a restoration of the way in which our cultural heritage has been radically dumbed down.
Yes.
And more people have been denied it. There's a sort of hyper-democratic ethos, a hyper-egalitarian ethos that forces people, in the name of what Russell Kirk, actually, in the conservative mind, invoking T.S. Eliot, calls the leveling impulse, the desire to just make everything absolutely uniform and equal. Any kind of high culture is regarded as elitist, and it needs as suspicious, and needs to be at the very least tamed, if not ruled out altogether. And you're very much of the view that not so much a restoration of fertility, but a restoration of high culture and a repudiation of that kind of little replacement, that sort of egalitarian assault on high culture, would reconnect us to our classics. And as you say, no people who is well connected and well versed in its classics is likely to surrender to its own replacement.
Yes, of course. I think what I call the little replacement, that is abolition of what we are forced now to call high culture, which was simply culture, was the condition of the Great Replacement. People who were conscious of its culture, of the history of its country, of its classical writer, and of culture in general, would never have accepted that horror, the genocide by replacement. I think without petit remplacement, small replacement, great replacement would never have been possible.
And why didn't you we were just having lunch, and you explained to me that there was a particular gentleman who found himself in charge of the CIRPO, one of the main universities, the cultural universities in France in the 1960s and 70s, and he very much saw it as his mission to try and surgically remove any connection that these students would have to their classics. What was this man's name, and what was his Philistine mission within the Scientific Political Academy in France?
Yes,
Paris?
Richard Descoings.
Yes.
Yes. he was a great enemy of general culture,
Yes.
because, and he was very right, general culture is quite unfair. General culture is something which doesn't come from school generally, but from your parents. As I like to say, in a rather provocative way. I don't want to be provocative, but most people take it as,
it's a bit late.
If you want to educate a child, the first thing to do is to educate his parents. A child with educated parents is very unfairly privileged. But there is a much more important person than Richard de Coin, is Pierre Bourdieu, which is my arch enemy, but an arch enemy which I absolutely respect. But he's a great thinker, like Marx. Is not, you can disagree with their conclusion, but you have to admit they are a great thinker. But Bourdieu has an enormous influence. He called a book, his main book, maybe it's called Les Héritiers. It's hard to translate in English, because in English it's the inheritors. And we were speaking of a conference I made with Roger Scruton in Edinburgh University, about 10 or 15 years ago. And my conference, in my broken English, was very difficult to match, including the title, because I wrote a book of the title called a sort of answer to Bourdieu. Bourdieu put upside down les inhéritiers, which in English would be the inheritors.
Yes.
Double negation.
Yes.
Inheritors. We live in a world of inheritors, people who are proud to have inherited nothing, and we think it's much more democratic and fair, which it is, but which is a total disaster for society. Of course, Bourdieu was perfectly right in saying that people with educated parents have an unfair privilege, but that's hardly a discovery. The 40th century of Western culture have known that.
Yes.
That was a slow movement of social promotion by trying to have children who would go further than yourself in education and diplomas and social standards. This will to have equality in that matter is a disaster for society, because the result is a disparition of heritage and culture and national consciousness.
One question I do have about that very briefly is, how do we then explain the fact that it tends to be the people in our societies, in Western societies, who are the most educated? Now, they may still have been disinherited in some way. Let's not pretend that they're incredibly cultivated people, but for want of a better word, the cognitive elites in Western societies, the people who have the most education, tend to support replacement migration at very overwhelming levels. And it's people who lack that education. It's people who are more consumers of popular culture who are most likely to raise their voices in resistance to replacement migration. If what I'm in favor of restoring high culture for its own sake, but I wonder whether it really is operative in this question, given the fact that there are so many people who are by no means denizens of high culture, who nevertheless are very, very opposed to what is being done to us.
Well, I think education with media and with drug are the great element of asservissement, of slavery. Education
bondage
is nothing more than teaching you that you must die, disappear, that what is taught, the only thing which is still taught in school is anti-racism. When people know nothing, they know only two things which are both wrong, that there are no races, and that in English there is no, or people have no plural form to address themselves,
Yes.
which is exactly the reverse of the truth. They are only plural form.
Yes.
And they are convinced that there are no race. Education is reduced to that. And you are speaking of people with a high level of education, but many times they are not inheritors, and they have many very high diplomas, but they have totally lost any contact with high culture. For one thing, I don't know if that is the case in English, but they speak a terrible French.
Yes.
You hear people at the radio in very cultural program, and they are teachers at Sciences Po and everything, and they make syntax mistakes in every sentence. They don't understand the structure of the language. And very often classical culture is totally unknown to them. And there is one thing, but as usual, this is one point where I am in the minority of the minority of the minority. I think that a very important point is the disparition of what I call music and what people call now classical music. Mm-hmm. And all those intellectuals you hear at the radio or teaching in university, when they are asked about their musical preference, not one of them ever mentioned music, what was called music before the change of meaning of the world at the end of the 20th century. That music, which was the most European thing, I think the music was the soul of Europe, has totally disappeared from culture, even from the culture of the cultivated people. They never mentioned it. When they're asked about music, they always mention pop artists, very often American, and through America, very often African. And then Afro-American music was a gate to African music and African dance, which is that kind of trance, which is now the normal mode of expressing strong feelings, yes. Which is coming back of Africa in the European body through the Afro-American music, which, strangely enough, shows is very industrial. Yes. Some people have seen that very well. Adorno, Gunther Anders, and even Gramsci very literally show those very strange affinities about African music or pop music, yes. Which is largely African through America, and industry. And see President Trump, everything he wants to express in, he goes, it's like an African dance, and it is just pop music and trance. It's like a machine.
This is the one.
It's Metropolis and or modern times.
Yes. No, you are right on the point of the little replacement, the petit remplacement. There is a how to put it? We're living through an age where our expert class, they're very credentialed. They have the credentials, whatever that means, but there's very little in the way of actual cultivation and sophistication. And as a result, they probably do feel more unmoored from their traditions, and therefore they take a more relaxed attitude to their preservation. Finally, Monsieur Camus, remigration is a topic that is very much on the agenda. Yes. In Europe at the moment. There is this belief that not only do we need to stop replacement migration, but we need to reverse it, because the process is we're halfway through an experiment. We're not at the beginning. We need to reverse as well as to stop. And presumably, well, I know for a fact that you view this as a form of demographic decolonization, yes. For obvious reasons, and that should make sense to people given the chronology of this conversation. But one question I do have for you: demographic decolonization is a more complicated affair then administrative decolonization. With administrative decolonization, you just need to be Gandhi, you lead a Quit India campaign, and the very few 200,000 British people, they leave, and then it's easy. In this case, we're talking about a process where a lot of people have friends who are mixed race, they have associates who maybe they're not even mixed race, they're like sort of black people living in Britain, certain Muslim people living in Britain, they spend their whole lives here. It's a very sort of integrated and entangled affair. It's quite difficult for many people to see how decolonization could be humane and peaceful and non-violent, given this very complicated and integrated situation. You were a very peaceful man. Gandhi is a hero of yours. You certainly don't want to do violence to anyone, and certainly not on the basis of their race. Many people don't understand that about you. But how would remigration of the kind that you want to see be morally defensible?
Remigration is indispensable to the fight against violence.
Okay.
The so-called multicultural society are awfully violent.
Yes.
Even the official press is now forced to admit that the situation is absolutely unbearable. I mean, there is violence every day, everywhere. Women are raped, including non-Nigerian women. People have the throat slit every day. There is no order whatsoever. The colonial population absolutely refused any local indigenous authority, having the right feeling that they are the occupier and they are the colonial force, and why should they obey to a people who has entirely submitted to their...
Do you want to remove, I mean, what is your threshold? Like, where do you set the limit? I mean, someone who's, so it's an English, a hypothetical example of, like, I think a lot of people in England, they feel, and in France, they feel that replacement migration has been disastrous. They agree that it's led to more violence, that it's led to more difficulty, but they also are, they've lived in this society for their whole lives, and they're inclined to think, well, my best friend's wife is half Pakistani, or what some of our best politicians are, black, or some of our best politicians are, nominal Muslims. Do you really want to remove all of these people, or is it just a case of getting the majority back to a reasonably secure number or proportion of the population, or is it a total decolonization?
I think remigration has to be processed with the maximum of discrimination. I'm very much in favor of discrimination. Discrimination has been the great moral and intellectual quality of philosophy in the Western world for 25th century at least. It was really the supreme quality, and now it is really the second career of Adolf Hitler, the world upside down. Discrimination is a crime among crimes.
Yes. And
I think remigration has to be processed with a lot of discriminations. That
in a good sense.
Distinction between all case, and certainly you do anything to avoid violence. The very principle of remigration is to avoid violence and a horrible situation, which is a real situation of Europe now. But there can't be any decolonization without remigration. It's not a very good example, but it is a clear example. It's an example of Algeria, which of course has more meaning in France than in England. But Algeria was practically the only country with Canada where there was a French population outside of France. And when Algeria became independent, of course, the Algerians thought that they would not be really independent if they had about 1/10 of their population being of a different culture, different religion, very important, and a different language and different relation to work, to love, to women, to everything. And they think that the population had to leave. And very important, the world over thought exactly the same way. There were not one nation in 1962 who protested because the French were expelled from Algeria. They were expelled in a horrible way, very violent, which I certainly do not recommend at all. It's a good occasion to show the difference of civilization, but there are many reasons to encourage remigration. Many ways, I mean. The first way being stop paying for immigration and colonization, like all the nationalist policy, which is paying people to come there and have children. If you stop paying for them, you can't give assistance. We don't want children to be suddenly left without, in a misery and without a roof, but we should clearly say that we won't pay any more for people having more than 2 children, be they indigenous or colonial. And that is very strong incitation to remigration. We have to cut all the reasons that people have to be there. Why don't they live in their own culture and civilization? And some people, many people, in England it's very obvious, but maybe even more than in France, don't belong to, they say, we should take them to their word. When they say they want Sharia, when they dress like they would be in Baghdad or in Central Africa, they obviously proclaim that they don't belong there and they don't want to be there. We take their word for them. We won't force remigration on people. We just take their word. When they say that when there is a sport football match and they go in the street because the team of the original country has won, they say that they are not French. Well, they're so pleased because Algeria has won. The Algerian in France, most of them are Algerians, and they should be treated as such. They wanted the French to leave Algeria. We want the Algerians to leave France. It's just...
And so, as you recommended, at least the process would be very humane, and it would be in the interests not only of long-term peace within France or within England, but also in the long-term interests of good relations between peoples across borders. But, okay, so finalement, you once wrote, nations and civilizations have been known to rise from the grave.
Yes.
Are you hopeful?
Yes, I am. I have a Lazarian conception of nations and of civilization, and of course, in that, Israel is a great example. Sometimes I said as a joke when there was very bad news about French culture and civilization, and I said, well, never mind, we'll come back in 2,000 years like the Jews. But we have not left yet, so maybe we won't have to come back only in 2,000 years. But we have to stay and to liberate and decolonize the country by immigration.
Monsieur Camus, merci.
Je vous en prie.